Good morning, everybody. Some exciting things happening in the world today. And with us, we have our esteemed guest, no stranger to most people on this show, Mr. Bruce Pardy, Professor Bruce Pardy. Coming to Bruce to know you so well now, Bruce, you're just Bruce.
That that's the way I like it, Nadine. Keep it up. That's the way to do it.
Awesome. Well, we have both had something kind of big come out in the last couple of days. I have released a book on Alberta independence and what a free and sovereign Alberta might look like. You're familiar with this, of course, because you've endorsed my book for me. Thank you so very much for doing that.
My pleasure.
And you have a wonderful article that truly does complement, actually, the timing of the release of my book, because you have released a draft of what a constitution could, maybe should, look like for Albertans.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
And so now that article, we can find that article on the C2C Journal.ca, right?
That is correct.
Now, is that the only place where people can find that right now?
That's the place it's been published. There are links leading to that site in various places like Twitter, but the thing itself is on C2CJournal.ca. Yes.
Perfect. So everybody, C2CJournal.ca, and that's where you will find a link to Bruce's constitution. And there's some notes in there as well that sort of give some explanation as to your thoughts and the logic around why you've proposed what you have.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Wonderful. And so my book is available. It's called Alberta Rising, A Principled Vision for a Sovereign and Free Nation. And that is available on Amazon.ca. And you can purchase that in soft copy, hard copy, or Kindle. So we're going to take the combination of both the work that I have done and, of course, the work that Bruce has done and really just have a conversation about how the two kind of work together around the big themes of the book and the Constitution. So, one of the big themes of my book was about principles, not policies, about staying out of the weeds. And if we set good principles, we wouldn't need so many policies. And now, Bruce, when I read your Constitution and we talked about it, that's exactly, I think, the same kind of theme you were going with. The government should have very, very limited power, and the citizens have all the power. So the best way to restrict things was to just not grant them to begin with.
That is correct. That's exactly right. Policy is a trap, in a way. So I like to think about it this way. Whenever you get into the territory of making policy, thinking of policy that you think the government should have, you've already bought into the idea of a central authority, because policy is a thing that big governments do. So once you're into that territory of thinking, oh, we should have a policy about that and a policy about this, okay, well, now you've played along with the game of having a big government. But a small government can be based on just a handful of principles, like you're alluding to. And those principles, if they are identified well enough, can make an architecture for the constitution and the governance of a free country. Once you're into policy, you're probably not in a free country anymore, because we have policies today in Alberta and in Canada and everywhere else that, coming out the yin yang, we have policies about everything. And what people tend to want to do is make more policy or make better policy or think that our problems are about bad policy. It's not about the content of the policy. It's about the existence of policy and the idea that governments are there to make policy. Governments should be smaller than that. It is not the role of government, I think, for the government to make policy about most things. If they are not leaving you to your own life.
That's a really good point because I just did an interview, as you know, with Preston Manning. And one of the big, probably, and I have a lot of respect for Preston Manning. Please don't anybody misinterpret
Of
this.
course.
But one of the
Right.
disappointments in the conversation there was it was very much like a politician who was hanging on to these policies. Oh, we can reform things. Um, but it was a matter of reforming what exists. And I think what
Right.
I'm proposing, I think what you're proposing is that we just kind of burn it to the ground and rebuild it. It's not about reforming it. It's truly a transformation, a peaceful political revolution where we kind of rewrite the from the ground up.
We have to apply what we've learned, and what we've learned from experience is that the system that we have doesn't work very well. And so the last thing that we should do in making a new and free country is to reproduce the old system that we know doesn't work. I say in the piece that in order for us to go where we have never been, we have to do what we have never done. We can't be afraid of the new. In order to strike out in a different direction, we're going to have to rethink this. And so a lot of what I've written in this Constitution is not going to be exactly what people are used to. Certainly not used to in the Canadian Constitution, but that's the point. If it looked like the Canadian Constitution, that 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 wouldn't be good. So I hope people will have an open mind and have ambition so as to establish a new kind of constitutional architecture for a new and free Alberta.
Yeah, no, you just touched a couple of the things too that parallel with my book. People ask me, why did I write the book and why now? And the why I wrote the book was because I think I want to provoke people to start to think critically about the institutions and the beliefs that we hang on to, because I
Right.
think those need to be reconsidered. And we have the benefit now of history, precedent, and an entire world full of other ways of doing things that we should take a look at who's getting the best results where and why. The other one
Right.
was because I see this jockeying already for positions of power, and that's okay. People want to position themselves as an authority, but when things start getting prescriptive at this stage, and Albertans haven't had a chance, in my opinion, to truly evaluate possibilities, that gives me some reason for concern. So part of the reason for putting the book out also was about um, challenging some of these people who are trying to kind of position themselves as positions of influence, but they, to me, are just literally restating old ideas. And it's like, well, just put a new flag on Alberta, everything else will stay the same. And that's not acceptable to me. As you've pointed out before, we need to get the Canada out of Alberta. And that means Alberta politics has to significantly change,
Yes.
because it's not just a Canada problem. We have many of the problems exist here at our own provincial level.
Yes. Yes. Well, the system that you have in Alberta provincially to govern the province is a smaller version of the system that exists in Ottawa and across the country. So it is exactly as you say. If all you do is keep what you have in Alberta and get rid of Ottawa, that really doesn't change very much. And
What's the
and so
point?
exactly, what's the point? What is the point? You haven't really changed anything fundamentally. You've traded some people for other people who are in positions of power, but the idea is to not have people in positions of power over you, and that is going to um, require disruption, not just in Canada but inside Alberta too, and that is going to be the political challenge because there are going to be people in Alberta, Albertans today, who are in positions of power, who will not want to give those up. They will want to preserve the system, so they preserve their status in the system. But from my point of view, and in accordance with the book that you've written, our project here is to change that system and to disempower the powerful people inside the system.
Now,
And
on
to do
that
that, you
note,
yeah.
you've proposed a very interesting thing, because the way I think you've stated it in your constitution was an amateur government.
Yes, right. So part of this architecture is to try and build a constitution with a state which is relatively powerless. But along with disempowering the institution, you also have to disempower the individuals who run the institution. And I've suggested that we should aim for an amateur public service. And what I mean by that is part of our problem is that we are subject to the tyranny of a professional ruling class. We have careerist politicians. We have entrenched bureaucrats. We have tenured judges. We have unionized employees. We have the so-called deep state. Now, I know that term comes from the United States, but we have a so-called deep state both in Ottawa and in Edmonton. And you want to put provisions in there that would prevent the creation of this kind of entrenched political class. And to do that, I've suggested that we have severe term limits, and they go like this. Everybody who serves the state in any capacity, you might be a politician, you might be a judge, you might be a bureaucrat, an expert of some kind, an employee, a consultant, a supplier, whatever the case is, you can serve the state for a maximum lifetime total of 6 years in any capacity cumulatively. So if you're a politician for 6 years, okay, great. You serve, then you're done. And you go back to the private sector. Now, you can't be an employee, you can't be a judge, you can't be a consultant, you can't be a technocrat. You've served, and you're done. So it's a revolving door. It's an amateur public service so that we get new people all the time and nobody gets entrenched and nobody has a career that's connected to the enlargement of the state and the institution they happen to be in. There's no reason to, because you'll be out soon. So people will understand that the way to build a career is in the private sector, and you're just visiting the state, and soon you'll be done.
I love that idea. And in my book, too, I have proposed term limits. Now, I said 2 terms, which would be 8 years for a politician. And I have been always an advocate of term limits on administration and bureaucracy, because that, for the most part, is not even the politicians, in my opinion, that have been so much the
Mm.
problem, because you can get a good politician that comes in that says, yep, we're going to burn it to the ground. We're going to make some changes here. We're going to, and yet then it's the bureaucracy and the system
Yes,
itself that prevents
that's
them
right.
from doing that. So I think that's really critical, and something I haven't heard a lot of people talk about, is that we need to confine and restrict the bureaucrats and the administration, the system itself. Right. And I like that revolving door kind of idea. So, for anybody who's listening and sees this, like, give us your feedback on this, because this is really what my book is about. I think this is what you're proposing, is that people need to start critically assessing, thinking what we're doing. And it needs to be a little bit the invisible hand, to steal a quote from Frederick Bastiat. It's you have to not only think about what you're proposing today, but what the long-term consequences of that look like. And I think the
Yes.
institutions we have today are a perfect example of the failures of not doing that.
Right. Agreed. Agreed. Here are a couple of ideas that I think we should keep in mind as we try and think this through. The assumptions to bring to the task of designing a new constitution, a new governing system. Number one, power corrupts. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person who gets into power is going to be corrupt. I'm not suggesting that, but the tendency is that the more power you have, the more corrupt you're likely to become. And so, one of the objectives is to make the state and its people as powerless as possible, and yet still have a state that serves a function. The other idea I want to mention is the idea that, and this goes back to what I said about policy. Keep in mind that the people who will be making the decisions inside the system, if you give the state and its people the power to make decisions, the presumption should be they will make decisions contrary to what you would like to see. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but it's often going to be. And so that's a disincentive for you to give them the ability to make decisions. That is one reason why we should make the state relatively powerless. So if you keep those two presumptions in mind, even if they're not always true, they are often enough true so that your system is designed well if it sustains itself in spite of those two ideas.
So, in doing that, then what powers should we give to the state?
Right. So the first power, okay, well, there's actually three, but I want to talk about the first one. But the three of them are this: the state's powers should essentially be limited to three areas. Number one is to keep the peace. Number two is to resolve disputes between people about keeping the peace. Let's say, your neighbor comes over and they steals your car or beats you up. Then you want a court to be able to go to and say, this has happened to me. I need a remedy, please. So keep the peace, resolve disputes. And three is to protect the country from the outside. You need a military, you need borders, you need rules about visitors, that kind of thing. But those three areas, and not much more, are the areas that the state would actually be given powers. So I want to go back to the first one, because I think the first one is sort of where the whole thing begins, which is to say this: we're trying to design a free country. What is that? I mean, what is freedom? What do we mean? And for my money, you are free if you are not subject to the force of other people. That is, people cannot coerce you. People cannot make you do things you don't want to do. And they'll do that by applying force to you or threatening to use force. Okay, so we have a rule. The basic rule of the Constitution is nobody can use force against other people. You can't take their stuff. You can't use violence, and a whole list of other things. It's a big definition, but that's the basic idea. And that includes the state too. The state cannot use force against you. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, here's a third idea to keep in mind. Every law is an expression of force.
Well, the government is force. That's what people need to, I think,
It is
truly
force.
understand.
So if we outlaw force, then that means that the government cannot create rules to push you around. The only thing that they can enforce against you is the rule against force. So if you go around beating people up, we want the police to be able to go and say, excuse me, we're going to, charge you and prosecute you. Fine. But that's the exception. Otherwise, the state can't do, all the various and sundry things it's doing right now. Like, just to take one random example, they can't develop a law or a policy that says you're not allowed to ride your bicycle without a helmet. Okay? Sorry, state can't use its force to enforce that law, therefore there is no law. And of course, the list of these things is endless. But just as one example.
Well, that brings us into a very interesting point because in my book, I did put in, now obviously it was very principled. I'm like, here's the principles. This is the reason that I've written the book. It's around these principles. I'm not so caught up in the policies. Some of the policies that I did make suggestions, I just kind of pulled from different examples around the world, just knowing Albertans, knowing Canadians, and how we love our healthcare and we love our education.
Right.
Can we get rid of all of that? Probably not. But
Mhm.
either way, there are ways of doing it better. But one of the things that you highlighted that I had not really thought of until you mentioned it to me was that if we do this and that we limit the government so well to it cannot force, anyone else to do anything except to restrict you from forcing yourself upon someone else, we
Mhm.
don't need a Bill of Rights because I included here's some
Right.
of my right because I've been so um, entrenched to believe we have all these God-given rights, and really our God-given right is freedom. And if we are
Correct.
truly free, then we are protected, to do what it is that we want to do. Nobody else can force us to do anything. And it really boils down to that one principle. So I thought that was fascinating. So, how did you come to conclude that, we don't really need a Bill of Rights if we do this? Like, where does this kind of thinking come from?
Okay, so most constitutions, including the Canadian, and for that matter, largely the American, are built with a particular infrastructure or architecture, if you like. It goes like this: the state is all powerful, It has endless jurisdiction to do anything. And I don't just mean the federal government. I mean, if you put all the bits of the state together, the, the province and the federal government, the executive branch, the courts, all together, the state altogether has unlimited authority. Those constitutions try then to limit that authority by saying, oh, by the way, here's a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights. And so the state can do anything except infringe these rights. Okay. Now you need the charter now because you gave the state an unlimited amount of power. But if you change the architecture and say, well, we're not going to do it that way, instead of making the state all powerful, we're going to make it powerless. The state can do nothing except. Now we're going to list exceptions that change the default from nothing to, okay, well, you can enforce the rule against force. Okay.
Well, what
If
we're
you
doing
have
is
that,
truly flipping the script entirely. We're
you're
changing it from the master
flipping.
servant to servant master relationship, which is the way it should be. And if
Yes.
we limit, and what you're saying is we're writing the Bill of Rights and the Constitution for the government that says, here's your limited amount of power that we grant you, and you can't do anything else but.
And you'll note if you have a Bill of Rights with that architecture, now you're undermining that whole setup, right? Because why do you need a Bill of Rights? Now the implication of that is, well, the state must be all powerful because you're now carving out exceptions to that. So not only do you not need it, you really shouldn't have it because it's redundant and inconsistent with what you're trying to do. And it also prevents having no Bill of Rights, having no charter, also prevents us from misconstruing the nature of freedom, which is what you're alluding to. We think now, because we have a charter, we think of our rights as these bits. We have the right to free speech. We have the right freedom of religion. We have the right to associate. Right? No. Those are just the various bits of a singular thing, which is you're free or you're not. If you are free, then you can speak, then you can associate, then you can worship. But it's not because those things are listed, it's because you are free. And what are you free from? You're free from the force of the state. And therefore, the state has no means to censor you, or as the case may be, anyway. So that's the, as you say, it is a flipped logic. It's flipping the default. And that's one of the places that this new system should begin.
I find that fascinating because that is truly about getting to the source, the core of the problems that we have. So either we are a free individual, a sovereign being, or we're not. And right now, we are living in a world of permissions. I talk about this in my book about licensing and registration. The government grants you permission to drive a car. They allow you to rent your home because you never own it, because don't pay the property tax. And you find out
Right.
very quickly who owns it. So it's a renter
Right.
state. You
That's
take
right.
a look at doctors, lawyers, all these licenses and registrations that have been granted. And, you don't comply there, Professor Pardy, and we're going to revoke that
That's right.
lovely certificate that you have. And I fall in the same thing in finance, with a chartered investment manager. I have terms, conditions, rules, all these things that I have to comply with, right? I need to be an obedient servant to my master. And our whole systems, all of our systems, all of our institutions have been constructed this way intentionally.
Yes, 100%, 100%. And we don't even notice because we think we have these freedoms. And then we have, of course, these requirements from the government, to behave properly. And we accept that because it's the space that we're used to. But the state has come to dominate nearly all the activity that we participate in, both in our business lives, in our commercial lives, in our employment lives, and increasingly in our personal lives. And you need to disempower this monolith so that lives carry on in its absence. It's not a good design that allows the government to seep into the nooks and crannies of your life on the pretense that it is protecting other people from you. That's not the right vision.
Now, noting that people are very adverse to change. This is a very big change in the way that we think about ourselves and our government and our institutions, because because this means we are now having to accept responsibility for our health, accept responsibility for our education, accept responsibility for our retirement. And um, that's a big shift. How do we help people overcome the fear and realize that this is truly possible, and it can be done?
Yes, yes, it can be done. It can be done. And so, you know, the more conversations that we have, the better. And there are all kinds of questions to ask. One of the questions that I like to ask people is, um, you want to be free, and that is great because you've seen what not being free is like. Okay, great. What do you mean? Like you want to be free, but you want to keep these things. And my favorite example is healthcare. So you want to be free, but you want to keep the existing healthcare system, the single payer public healthcare system.
The
That that
monopoly.
that
I love people. It's universal. No, it's not universal. Universal would still leave room for competition. It is a monopoly.
it's a monopoly, but it's even. I mean, it is a monopoly, but it's also. I mean, let's just. It is a. I mean, it's socialized. It's even called socialized medicine, but it's actually it is a more centralized, and I hesitate to use the word lightly, but it's a communist like system. It's a communal system wherein you can only get the services the state will grant you, and there is no other way to get the services that the state claims to provide. And if on a particular day the state doesn't want to give it to you, then it won't, and there's no other way to get it. And this is exactly the opposite of being free. And so I say to those people, okay, you want to be free? Great, great. What do you mean? You can't mean the single payer public healthcare system because that is the opposite of free. You haven't thought this through. So let's think about it again. What do you mean? And through having these kinds of conversations, you can get people to think again about the assumptions that they're bringing and the things that they think they want to keep, which are in contradiction to the thing that they claim to want.
Yeah, and that was really the premise of my book, was we really need to challenge our own assumptions. We need to challenge our own beliefs. And I've, did little quotes. So, even the duty of the patriot by Thomas Paine. The duty of the patriot is actually to protect the citizen from the government. That is
Yes.
really what it
Right.
is. And so when we talk about force, so I'm going to bring up taxation, because
Yes. Please.
taxation
Please do. Yeah.
is the biggest, I think, and most corrupt use of power by the government. If you want to talk about something that's immoral and unjust, it's taxation. Somebody living in their home for 30, 40, 50, 60 years loses it because they can't pay property tax, because some government has arbitrarily assigned a market value to it and they can't pay for it.
Yep.
Taxation, even of your labor. If we're truly free, I'm the individual. And we have intellectual property rights in this country. We acknowledge that. If I produce something, it is mine. And yet, here I am producing labor and benefits, and I have a small business. And what's the government do? They punish me for it by taxing me. So, where did they get the right to tax me to do that to begin with if I'm a free individual? Especially, and the hypocrisy of having then an intellectual property right, yet they can tax my labor. So, but that's force. The government uses force to do that. And we've said that
Right.
in this new structure, the government won't have force, so it won't be able to do that. But then how are we going to pay for the roads, Bruce?
Right. Well, this is a good question. I want to get back to the intellectual property bit uh, in a minute, but let's deal with taxes first. So I agree with you completely. Extraction of taxes is the government's use of force. And we've said government can't use force to influence your behavior, and paying taxes is a behavior. So government can't extract taxes from you. And by the way, if they did, then for my money, any activity that they provided with using those taxes is also an expression of force. So, for example, people might say, well, if the government advertises a certain message, on a billboard or online, that's not the use of force. And my answer is, yeah, it is, because they're using your tax money to do it. Without that force, the message is not possible. So that's out. That's out. We'll go back to the roads in a minute. Let me just deal with intellectual property just for a sec. Intellectual property is itself a product of the state.
Mhm.
So most of our intellectual property regimes are products of legislation. And if we are, so here's how they work. So if somebody invents a thing and gets a patent, the government gives them a patent. What does the patent mean? It means that other people can't use their own stuff, and by stuff I mean physical materials, and fashion them in a certain way, because if they do, the government will punish them. In other words, the government is providing the patent holder with a monopoly. If we have said that the government can't use force except to prohibit force, then we don't have intellectual property. No patents, no copyright. The government can't prevent anybody from doing what they want with their stuff. And therefore, if I write a book and people read the book and they like the book and they want to print the book, they can print the book. If I invent something that in this world is patentable, no patents. So, we all use wheels, we all use fire. Those things are not patented. People will think up new ideas and invent things, and those ideas belong to the whole world, because the only way to keep them to yourself is to use the government to use its force to prevent people from doing things. Right?
That's a
So
whole new
intellectual property,
world of open source.
a whole new open source world. We do not use the state to create commercial monopolies. And by the way, that would eliminate an awful lot of the trouble that we are maybe going to have ahead with things like AI, because AI is owned by the people who have invented and created and written the program and so on. The rest of us are going to be without a job, and these particular individuals will going to own the whole show only because the government has given them a right to restrict the use of things in other people's lives.
Now,
But you asked a good question. Sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead. Keep going.
Well, I was going to go to the question of how you fund the state, and it's a very good question. It's a vexing question. Now, one of the difficulties that we have, and you and I have talked about this, is in Alberta, like in other provinces, a vast amount of space is owned by the Crown. In a free country, that won't do. And of course, in independent Alberta, I hope the Crown will have no role at all. There'll be no Crown, I hope. But even so, you'll have all this land that is not privately owned. So the question is, okay, so how do you transition from this situation to one that should exist in a free country? Okay. And there are some choices, but there are no easy choices. You don't want to raffle off the land because some people will end up with valuable stuff and other people won't. You don't want to auction it off because much of the province or the new country will end up in wealthy hands as opposed to being shared by everyone. You don't really want the government to hold the thing still because that's the role they have now, and you don't want the government to be participating in the economy. You don't want to pretend that the government is acting on behalf of the common good, because it's shown that they don't do that right now. So what are we going to do? And what we do, there is potential in that resource so that you might be able to generate revenue that could be used for state expenses, keeping in mind that the expenses of the state in this new model will be vastly, vastly lower than what we have now, because the thing will be much, much, much more limited. But nevertheless, there will be some costs, especially running a military. So you could have the government hold it and give beneficial interests, like legal in the law, beneficial property interests to each citizen in those common lands, which would generate revenue for both for state purposes and then a beneficial payment to each citizen at the end of the year. That's got some appeal, but it's also not so great because you're still giving the government a central role in the administration of things. Another idea is to, instead of raffling off parcels of equal size to different citizens, you could assign citizens randomly plots of land with roughly equal market value. Again, attractive, but also difficult because you still need a government to administer that process. And you want to make sure it's done transparently and that everybody does, in fact, receive a thing of comparably equal value. It's a bit sticky. Getting from here to there is sticky. And I'm not convinced of any of these solutions just yet. I recognize the potential in those lands to produce revenue to cover the state's expenses. So you do not need tax of any kind, no income tax especially, but you shouldn't need tax of any kind in a new and independent Alberta.
Well,
But
yeah, and I would say
that detail,
the
yeah,
tax the citizen, because I know, like, when Canada was first established, taxation is a fairly new thing, honestly,
sure,
to taxing the citizen as far as labor goes, and people understand. But we think, like, now it's been around for so long that so many people think, oh, we've always been taxed. No, we haven't. It was a temporary measure to pay for the war, right? And of course, government
yeah,
never said anything.
and the war is over now.
Wow, I don't know. It just seems like there's one more after another. But the
Yeah,
reality is, we used excise taxes and customs and those types of things that, we if people wanted to do business with us and things were imported, we would charge them a fee, right? I mean, that's what
sure,
I would call it, that more so. And you're seeing Donald Trump even kind of going back to a little bit more of that. Going, you want to do business with us? We're the biggest economy, great, but we're going to charge you access. So, for me, I look at things like that and I'm going, I've had to rethink myself. How do we deal with this problem? Because you and I have talked
right,
about this one at great length.
yes,
And it's like, it's
yes,
not an easy problem to solve. And even things like a sovereign wealth fund, like you said, you are inviting the government into um, the economy a little bit, and I think there's ways that you can limit that, but again, it's limit, not eliminate. So they collect the revenues, but then there's a private group that manages it on behalf. But again, there's still, then you have some authority that's managing public assets, whether it's government
yes.
direct or indirect, it's still government.
Correct. And that's a danger. Now, we've minimized the danger by limiting their other powers and limiting the tenure of people who are in the government. So it might not be as dangerous as it might be right now. But nevertheless, in order to assess these solutions, we have to imagine the worst case scenario. So let's go back to your excise taxes, your export taxes, for example. Let's say that at some point in time, Alberta had a government, politicians in power or bureaucrats that were limited by the Constitution, so they can't make policies about all kinds of stuff. But it so happened that the people in power were of the view that climate change was a big problem and that we shouldn't be using oil and gas in Alberta. And we have given them the power to impose export taxes. Okay. Well, what could they then do? They say, all right, we are going to put a tax on our exports of oil and gas of of 150% so that we don't sell any of it. Now, the purpose of giving them the power was to raise taxes, but they're going to use it for the purpose of making sure we don't sell any. Okay. Now you got a problem because we gave the state the power to make policy about that question, and we assumed too much about the degree to which they would agree with us. So that's the kind of thing to avoid.
Yeah, my biggest concern for most people is this is so it's coming across as so complex that people avoid complexity and they avoid difficult situations, right? And again, I don't think that this is insurmountable, and I don't think that
No.
I have come to realize that we are probably going to have to give the state more power than we would like to, but we want to constrain that as much as we can, just because I understand human psychology and I know where people are at. So maybe we do end up having a universal health care, but what does that look like? So I've kind of resolved myself to, let's aim for the stars, but we may just end up at the moon for now. But the one thing that politicians, what do you think politicians are thinking right now as we're having this conversation?
Well, I hope they're thinking that my that they're that if we succeed in this, that their careers as politicians will be very short-lived, and similarly for bureaucrats, and similarly for judges. These are things that you should not have a career in anymore. You will visit and then you will leave, and that's the way I think it ought to be. Uh, I think we've had enough of people on the inside, basically, some of them making fortunes in their own way out of being public servants. That has to come to an end. It is the way that they give themselves status and power inside a hierarchical system. If you get rid of that incentive, or group of incentives, financial, social, careerist, if those incentives don't operate anymore, then most people won't aspire to achieve any of those things inside the system. Instead, they will aspire to achieve it where they're supposed to, which is outside in the private sector, which is where we want all the people doing all the imaginative, creative, competent, successful things.
And I think that's one of the things that maybe is a good place to sort of end on, because um, it is really truly the free citizen versus the state. And
Yes,
I keep telling people we can't expect politicians to do this for us because it is not in their interest to do this for us. Um, you know,
exactly,
when you
exactly, well put.
threaten somebody's livelihood, you threaten their career. This is why government continues to grow and grow and grow, because the easiest way to capture a vote is to employ it, to make it
Right.
dependent upon you. And so this is can't be politicians who we ask to do this, because it'll never happen. So this truly has to be a citizens initiative, citizen led advocacy, the average person. And people think that by making healthcare competitive and getting away from this monopoly that we have in public care, making education, getting away from this public education, and making it competitive. They think, oh my goodness, it's the little guy that's going to lose. I'm here to tell you, it's
Right.
the little guy who's got everything to gain. Everything to gain. Education today is based upon your postal code, right? Unless you've got the money and the resources. And who's got the money and the resources? The politicians, the ones who benefit from the system to pay for private education,
That is
private healthcare.
exactly right. That is exactly right. Exactly right. Big government does not exist for the benefit of the little guy. It is exactly the reverse. And if we keep that point in mind through the whole thing, we'll be way further ahead.
Wonderful. I think that's a really great spot to end it. Bruce, as always, thank you so much for your insights. C2cjournal.ca is Bruce's ideas around the Constitution. Wonderfully written, great ideas in there, even some of them that just, made me think a little bit differently. Challenge everybody to go check that out. And of course, buy my book. Alberta Rising. This is our opportunity to do something that the world is watching. And the world, I think, is so hungry for somebody to actually show some real leadership and do something for the benefit of the average everyday citizen. Like, I mean, because people just throw their hands up in the air and they don't know what to do. So, Amazon.ca, Alberta Rising, C2C Journal.ca, the Articles of Freedom, what Constitution of an Independent Alberta could be. God bless you all. Bruce, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadine. Great to be with you, always.